Hello everybody and welcome to the webinar number 13 in the Open Discovery Space series. This webinar is entitled Metadata Content Integration in ODS. This webinar aims at introducing the concept of harvesting as well as the protocols and technologies related to harvesting in ODS. After this webinar, the audience will be familiar with ODS metadata workflow and integration scenarios, will be aware of intellectual property right issues related to metadata ingestion in ODS, and will know more about the contractual implications of signing over metadata rights, as well as other legal commitments. The speaker will be Enayat Rajabi. He's a researcher at University of Alcalá. He's coordinated University of Alcalá works at ODS Working Package 7, which includes everything related to harvesting and other content integration tasks in ODS. Now I hand it over to Enayat. Enayat, please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. So this webinar is about the content integration in Open Discovery Space. So we will cover the following subjects: the ODS harvesting strategy, the integration that we followed for the workflow in the Open Discovery Space, the integration scenarios that we followed for the ODS contents and ODS e-learning resources, and the roles and responsibilities that exist in the harvesting and content integration scenarios. So here we outline the harvesting strategy that we followed in Open Discovery Space. The metadata information that's harvested from the repository by the harvester will be stored in a server, so-called Open Discovery Space repository. This repository aggregates the metadata and XML files and e-learning resource from the other repositories that are the ODS partners, so that afterwards the ODS portal can show the contents and the ODS users can search among the e-learning resources as well. So during the harvesting, in the previous webinar, we mentioned that how we enrich the Open Discovery Space metadata. So after this enrichment, the metadata records will be available through the ODS portal. So at the first level, one server or one software should be used for the harvesting this metadata. In this case, we used Ariadne. Ariadne as a software for harvesting and aggregating, as well as validating the metadata in the repository federation. So there are a lot of services that Ariadne has. One of them is Harvester. So if you install a Ariadne instance on your machine, you will be able to harvest the metadata through OAP-MH target. We mentioned this protocol in our previous webinar. So an Ariadne service allows, an Ariadne harvester allows you to harvest and gather the metadata through this protocol. It has also another services called the validation service, which allows to validate the metadata against your customized application profile or predefined application profile as well. As you can see in this picture, The harvester is on the heart of this topology and can harvest metadata and XML files and other type of the files from the repository. So this is ODS harvester, and this is in this side you have the ODS partners and ODS repositories, and afterwards the harvester allows this information to be available through file system or some API, like for example SPI services in the repository. So we have two servers here, harvester and repository. And so the role of harvester here is gathering and aggregating the information and e-learning resource and pushing this information on the ODS repository. On the other side, the portal or search services can query this type of resource from the ODS repository as well. So what is the aggregate integration workflow that we have in Open Discovery space? As we mentioned, there is a ODS application profile which is designed based on IEEE LAM, and it exists some vocabularies, some rules and regulations that allows other partners to define and to align their metadata according to this application profile. So metadata of the e-learning resources stored in Open Discovery Space repository according to this application profile. At the first level and at the predefined application profile, it can be LAM-based, IEEE LAM-based application profile. So we have different scenarios according to repository schema. If the repository schema is simple IEEE LAM and is according to ODS application profile, this will be the simplest way to harvest them. And so the integration workflow in phase will be presented in two phases. So in the phase one, for gathering the information in the ODS portal, we used a very simple scenario. In this way, we collected and aggregated those repositories that are compliant to IEEE LAM and harvested those metadata and pushing this information in the ODS repository using Ariadne-powered infrastructure. So, and because Ariadne has another service, which is a search API, it allows the ODS portal to search the ODS repository using Solar services. So in the phase one, we have a simple schema IEEE LAM, and we harvested those repositories that are compliant. And afterwards, we push the information in the ODS repository. But in phase two and in the reality, there are a lot of repositories that are not completely compliant to IEEE LAM. So they have their own schema, for example, Dublin Core. So there should be a way to convert their schema to the ODS application profile. Because we don't know the structure of the repository's schema, so there should be a way to mapping their schema to the ODS application profile. To this way, the repository's owner should provide the XSLT file so that this XSLT file is used for converting their schema to the ODS application profile. So in the phase two, the story is different because something that we are harvested are not compliant to the IEEE LAM maybe or ODS application profile. So Each repository may have its own vocabulary, its own schema, and after the harvesting, we have different types of metadata in different schema. That's why in this phase we have a mapping step, which means this step uses the vocabulary mapping XSLT file from the repository owners that allows the repository system or Ariadne infrastructure to map the source schema to the ODS application profile. After this step, after this phase, the ODS repository includes those metadata that are completely compliant to the ODS application profile, and afterwards, the type of search is advanced. So, for example, here you can have some filtering over the results, and you can implement your own, for example, modules in the portal side. So it is very important to know that, for example, in the Open Discovery space, at the ODS side, as a technical team of the ODS side, they can import the XSLT file of the repository owners. So there is a repository owner who is on this metadata of the repository, and he or she should provide a mapping file to say, for example, the Dublin core title is mapped to, for example, general title of article long. Apart from this schema mapping, there should be a vocabulary mapping. For example, say, okay, the target vocabulary is, for example, let's say science, but the source is something different. So maybe there are some language problems. So this here the repository owner is who is decide to map its source schema to the final schema as well. So the role of this XSLT file is very important here. For example, we had the Dublin core schema repository that they had, for example, 6 or 7 elements, and we asked the repository owner, and the owners provided this mapping as well, and we could import this XSLT file into the Ariadne infrastructure so that we could integrate their metadata file into the ODS repository. So something is very important from the repository sides. So they should respect some rules and regulations so that we can harvest them. For example, we should, the technical guys from the Open Discovery space should be connected to the repository owner, and we should fix a date for the harvesting. We should agree on the definition for our archives, manage our repository, the OAP mentioned lifecycle. If they, for example, provided the updated mechanism, we should know, we should be informed about that. For example, the technical guys of the ODS should know about the deleted mechanism of the repository partners. So there should be some coordination between the repository owners and technical guys in the Open Discovery space, or technical guys in each harvesting sites. So apart from that, if there are some errors, for example, language errors, or there are some mapping errors that maybe we can identify during the importing this data into ODS portal, there should be tracked by through both sides. For example, by checking the several logs, we can distinguish the errors, and we can inform this information to the repository owners, and they can resolve the issue so that we can have the clean information in the ODS portal. Apart from that, data providers should have an integration approach, which means that they should know that something is prerequisites for the harvesting. For example, having a OAPMH target is mandatory for the repository owner. So after providing their metadata, after creating this mapping file to convert their schema to the Open Discovery Space application profile schema, and after mapping their own vocabulary from their own language to the Open Discovery Space vocabulary, then they can inform the technical guys in the Open Discovery Space to harvest their repository owner. It doesn't mean that Open Discovery Space doesn't help, for example, repository owner in this case, but as we mentioned in our previous webinar, Open Discovery Space provided a tool named Mint for the repository owners so that they can map their own schema to the ODS schema or ODS application profile. And using this tool, they can create their XSLT file easily, much easier than doing this work using manually. So what are the roles and responsibility in our harvesting process, the content integration process? There are different roles in a harvesting process. First, some roles are assigned to the harvester side, which is here Open Discovery Space Harvester, and some roles are dedicated to the repository owners. In each part, we have a technical team. The technical team of the harvester manage all the stuff of the harvesting, enriching, importing the metadata into ODS portal. And technical guys from the repository side is responsible for creation metadata, resolving the importing issue from the repository side to the ODS application profile. So both sides should have a technical team to resolving any issue that we may face during the integration process. So we will explain the responsibility in detail in the following slides. But before that, we want to know what kind of scenarios we may have in the content integration. These scenarios is dedicated when you want to harvest some repository according to IPMH protocol. So here we again insist on this protocol, which is in the Open Discovery Space is mandatory for harvesting. And the first scenarios and the first priority are those repositories in the Open Discovery Space that are ODS partners. So the aim of these content integration scenarios was consideration of different options that we have for integrating the ODS partners into the ODS repository, the resources of the ODS partners into the ODS repository. So, as we mentioned before, for some repository which harvesting of metadata is very difficult for them, we provided a tool for creating the XSLT file. So in the first scenario, we focused on those repositories that were compliant to ODS application profile. And then we helped those repositories that their schema were different from ODS application profile. And afterwards, they could create their own mapping file for the content integration into the ODS repository. Here, for example, for these scenarios in the picture that is depicted here, there is a repository that is a non-ODS application compliant. Their schema, for example, is doubling core or ITEP or other kind of the schemas. So there is a team here, which is the alignment experts, can say that, okay, the source element here is equal to that element, the target. After creating this file, they provide this XSLT file for the technical team in ODS harvesting side, and afterwards we can harvest their metadata according to this protocol, OAP-Mesh target protocol. We use their XSLT file to transform their metadata to the ODS application profile, and afterwards we push this information into the ODS portal. So as we mentioned before, mapping of metadata elements and a schema is very important. Mapping of the repository vocabulary to ODS application profile vocabulary is very important. Here I have an example. For example, if there is an element in the classification of the e-learning resource in the source repository, we in the ODS application profile we may not have this classification. For example, astronomy. Let's consider that this vocabulary in the source repository doesn't exist in the ODS vocabulary. So we need a domain expert in the repository side to tell us that how we can map this vocabulary to the ODS vocabulary as well. Or there may be some issues about the language. For example, we don't know the source language and we want to identify that, okay, there is a vocabulary in the source, but what is this vocabulary in the ODS vocabulary target? So after distinguishing all these issues, creating a XSLT file is happen, and this XSLT file is imported into the Ariadne infrastructure so that we can transform the source schema to the target schema as well. So as we mentioned before, preparing an OAP mesh target is another important step that should be done by the repository owners. And this is the responsibility of the ODS owner and the technical team of the repository side. In the case that the collection are stored in online repository, which does not support the OP mesh target, there should be first implemented this protocol. But in any case, we have exceptions for those repositories that their content are very related to Open Discovery Space, and we want to join them to our to our portal in the ODS application, in ODS portal, and we use some techniques to import their information into the ODS repository as an exceptions. So, as we mentioned, there are some roles and responsibility. One of the roles is repository representative, who is not necessarily a technical person, but who is a domain maybe expert and can decide that, okay, what kind of metadata should be exposed for ODS, and what are the copyright issue in this case, when we can start harvesting or something like that from the repository sites. And their technical team. For sure, the domain expert cannot provide, for example, XSLT file. So each repository should have an expert, a technical expert, to provide this information for us. How to provide, for example, XSLT file, or should know how to create this file technically. From the harvesting perspective here, for example, from the ODS harvester perspective, we have again a content board, a person or group that decide of the quality of the new repository, which repository should be integrated, or their content are aligned to the ODS or not. And another roles and responsibilities about the ODS integration manager. There are technical people who work on coordinating and integrating the repository resources into the ODS repository. But in the case that there are some problems in the repository side, there are some roles and responsibility that that assign to the metadata, let's say, point of view. For example, metadata creator, who is responsible for creating the metadata manually or using the tools, or metadata validator, who is expert in validation of the metadata, who can say, okay, for example, this metadata is available and validated against the source schema. So this metadata validator is different from the creator of the metadata. Maybe the technical knowledge of these two people are different. And the technical expert who is responsible for compliance of metadata record with the ODS application profile. This technical expert is the guy who says that, okay, you should provide this mapping file in this way, and is responsible for creating the XSLT file. There are several steps for those repositories that they want to be integrated in Open Discovery Space. First, they should know about the ODS project, what is the implication of this project, what is the content and the type of the content in the Open Discovery Space project. Then they can contact to the coordinator and to the Open Discovery Space managers, and afterwards, after this agreement between them and having the same idea about the integration and what kind of content and how many contents they can provide for the ODS. They can pass these technical checking of the metadata. For example, what is the metadata? What is the repository metadata schema, and how they can provide this access. For example, how they can provide this OPMH target, how they can validate, and how they can create this XSLT file. Together with the manager, they can provide a schedule, to so that the technical team in Open Discovery Space can harvest the repository as well. So when a repository is integrated to the Open Discovery Space, there are some advantages of this integration. For example, from the Open Discovery Space portal, their end user can, from one port, all the end users can access to the repository contents, and all the information and all the copyright issue and rules in Open Discovery Space is can be used for the repository content as well. So according to the agreement that the ODS and the repository has against each other. So it's very obvious that if one repository has its own IPR and its own copyright issue and the rules and the regulations to use their actual resources, they should be considered here. For example, we had a repository that they used some username and password for accessing their content. So they provided the metadata information on their page, and afterwards to accessing the final information and final, the actual learning resource, we had a negotiation with the repository to either remove these credential from their resources, or they provide the open learning resource of their contents. So it's very important that the IPR issue should be considered when a repository wants to integrate to the Open Discovery Space project. So there are some rules in IPR, for example, in Creative Commons license, that the repository can provide their information according to this license. And for sure, Open Discovery Space has its own rule, and it's kind of these IPR rules that when a repository is integrated to the Open Discovery Space is covered by these rules as well. And this information is provided in the first agreement that is carried out by Open Discovery Space and repository at the first place. And there are some rules and responsibilities and regulations about how contents can be reached in Creative Commons, which is available through these links. But in any case, maybe each repository has its own IPR that should be considered during the integration, as I mentioned before. The proposed exercise is connecting your resource with ODS. As we mentioned before, for if you want that your repository is integrated and is harvested by the Open Discovery Space, you should provide the OAP image target. You should be aware of the Open Discovery Space profile, including their schema, which is based on IEEE LAM, and you should be aware of the vocabulary that is used in the Open Discovery Space application profile, and afterwards, if your schema is not compliant to IEEE LAM, you should provide the XSLT file for mapping your schema to the Open Discovery Space schema, and then the story is very easy. You provide your OAP image target for us and for the ODS technical guides, and we harvest your metadata, and we align your metadata, and we enrich as well as validate your metadata into the Open Discovery Space, and afterwards your metadata will be available through the ODS portal. Considering those cases that we mentioned in these slides, including the IPR, including the first agreement with the ODS managers and coordinators, because the only point which is important here is the quality and relatedness of your content and Open Discovery Space. So if you have a good number of resource, you have good resource in terms of quality, and they are related to Open Discovery Space atmosphere, and that this resource can be easily integrated onto ODS portal. So these are very detailed information about the ODS integration process. And for more information, you can ask your question of me, or you can contact me or other colleagues in University of Alcala or Open Discovery Space as well. Roberto, I'm available for any question you may have.
Thank you, Enayat. I have I have one question. You spoke about a mechanism for publication or harvesting of metadata called SPI. And I wonder in which cases is it okay to use SPI instead of the normal approach?
Yes, Ariane actually, which is kind of a harvester, allows your metadata to be published either in some API or some file system or through some database. So in three ways you can publish your metadata. The SPI can be used for the Ariadne search finder. So if you want to use a search, very simple search finder of the Ariadne, this can be used of the SPI, or you can implement your own module to use this SPI mechanism to get the metadata from the Ariadne and publish it in your portal. In our case, in Open Discovery Space, we use the second approach, the file system. So in the phase 2, because we wanted to import this metadata into the ODS portal, we harvest the metadata, and afterwards we convert it or published in the file system. And we had another step to import these XML files to the relational database as well. So the SPI can be used for Ariadne Search Finder, which is a integrated, I mean, embedded tool of the Ariadne, you know.
Okay, thank you for your answer. It seems there are no questions from the audience, so we can finish the webinar. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nayat, for your presentation, and thank you, everybody, for your attendance. I just want to remember that you can replay the webinar on YouTube. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye.